I want to thank you for watching our podcast. We're picking up today in the book of 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, starting with verse number 21. The Apostle Paul is continuing to teach on false apostles. And this is what he says now in verse number 21. He says, "To my shame, I must say that we have been weak." And then in the New American Standard, it adds these two words. By comparison, they're not in the Greek text, so we're just going to look at what's in the Greek text here. But again, the Apostle Paul is using a form of rhetoric, and it's a form of teaching people. And so he says, "To my shame, I must say that we have been weak." In other words, the Apostle Paul is saying, you know what, guys? We haven't been as strong as we could be in talking about these false apostles. And he says, you know what? Really, it can be to my shame. And so what Paul's doing is he's getting the attention of the Corinthians. Now, keep in mind, this letter was read in public. And so there are people, if you can picture this, there are people in the audience. Some of them don't have the ability to read. Now in Corinth, most of them would. But they are being read this letter, and all of a sudden Paul says, "To my shame." How many of you know that if your pastor would get up in the pulpit on Sunday and say, "To my shame," he would have the attention of everybody in the church? What's Paul doing? He's using rhetoric to gain the attention of the Corinthian people, because shame was something that they thought was very, very, very bad. And so Paul uses something that's very bad. Now, he's not walking around hanging his head going, "Oh, woe is me. I'm no good." That's not what Paul's doing. Paul is using rhetoric to get the attention of the Corinthian people. But he says, "To my shame, I must say that we have been weak." And then he goes on in verse number 21, "But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold myself." So Paul says, to my shame, I'm weak. And then he turns right around and he says, "But whatever respect anyone else is bold." In other words, if anybody else has any boldness at all. And then he says, "I speak in foolishness." Again, he's using rhetoric. He's getting their attention. And he says this, but he says it, "But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold myself." What's Paul saying? He's saying, I've got boldness. I am telling you what you need to hear. I'm not giving in. I'm not backing down. I'm not hiding. I'm bold. I'm bold with this message. I'm standing up for this message that I've got. Paul's boldness it meant that not that he was saying, "Hey, look at me." He was saying, "This is what I'm doing. I am standing up and I am addressing a problem in the city of Corinth and in the church at Corinth. I am bold." Now notice what he says. Are they Hebrews? Verse number 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Now, what's he doing here? He's actually identifying some of the false apostles, some of the false leaders. Some of them were Hebrews. Some of them were Judaizers, were people that have slipped into the church, and they are saying, "Yeah, you Gentiles, you need to be circumcised. You can't eat pork chops. You can't do this and you can't do that." And so Paul says, "Are they Hebrews?" And then he adds, "So am I. I'm a Hebrew." You know, Paul said, "I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees." Or I was a Pharisee. Are they Hebrews? Yeah. They're Hebrews. These people that have slipped in, they are Jewish people. But they've slipped in trying to devour, trying to enslave. We talked about that earlier this week. Trying to mislead the people of God. And then he goes on and he says, are they Israelites? So am I. I'm an Israelite. I am a person who comes from the tribes, the chosen of God. I am an Israelite. And then he goes on, he says, are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. So Paul here is identifying these false apostles. And these false apostles, I believe, that through this identification here in verse number 22, Paul is telling us that these are Jewish people in and trying to devour, trying to enslave, trying to mislead the church. And they're making themselves out as servants of righteousness, but in all reality, they are servants of Satan. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to Monday's podcast and listen to it. Now, moving on into verse number 23. Are they servants of Christ? And then Paul says this, I speak as if insane. I more so. What's Paul saying? He's saying, I am a servant of Christ. And then the Apostle Paul begins a whole list of things. And why does he do this? Does he do this to brag? No, he does this to get people to understand that he is serving Jesus. And by the way, let me just say this. When you start serving Jesus, it is not something rosy. It's not something beautiful. I remember way back, the man who led me to Jesus. And you know, one of the things that he said, you know what, Leon? Now everything is going to be great. Well, you know what I found out? My friends did not appreciate me serving the Lord. In fact, there was a time where they said, Leon, if you don't stop talking about Jesus, we don't want to be your friends anymore. And you know what? That night I had to make a decision. Is it Jesus or was it my friends? It wasn't always great. There were times we've gone through hardships. And the Apostle Paul is using those times as an example of someone who is a servant of God. Let me just close this podcast. I really don't want to get into this list until tomorrow. Let me just close this podcast. Just because you become a servant of God does not mean that everything's going to be great. But what it does mean is that God's going to walk with you through it all. Yes, there's going to be times where people are going to befriend you because you're a Christian. They're going to say nasty stuff about you because you're a Christian. If you're a servant of God, things are not always going to be great. But Jesus is with you wherever you go. Remember that today. Join us again tomorrow as we begin this list of what the Apostle Paul talks about as being a servant of God. Thank you for watching.